But despite this, among many other things, Yamasaki was an outstanding student as a child. And he was also very hardworking, because we see this with his experience that he tells us about his summers growing up as a child. He worked in canneries, canning things like food, like fish. And at the time, these canneries were incredibly dangerous places to work, as in people would routinely lose fingers or even sometimes whole hands and limbs, things like that. So we can see he was a very determined and hardworking individual, even from a young age. Now, Yamasaki saw discrimination like this also affect members of his family, not just himself. And one very notable example is his uncle, who was a man named Koken Ito. Now, Koken Ito was an architect who worked in Chicago. Now, Koken Ito was not born here in the United States. He was born in Japan. And at the time, this was about the 1930s, late 1920s, there were laws in the United States that forbade people from certain Asian countries from ever obtaining United States citizenship. So eventually, Koken Ito returned to Japan. He did not stay here to become a US citizen. But before he left behind a legacy that sparked one of the most prolific architectural careers in modern history, because Yamasaki himself has credited his uncle with being the man who sparked his love for the field of architecture. He described on many occasions how he would visit his uncle in Chicago, and he would look over the design sketches from his uncle's work, and he described it as it looked with utter fascination. And so, having this experience, looking at the drawings, looking at these beautiful buildings that his uncle was a part in designing, he decided, there must be a brighter side to life, because he would juxtapose it with his experience in the canneries. You think, there's no point in doing this for the rest of my life. I could do something more fulfilling. That is when he decided to pursue a degree in architecture. And now, even though he had this very lofty, ambitious goal, racism and discrimination still followed him wherever he went. And this only got worse in 1941 when Japan bombed Pearl Harbor. Because once this happened, hate crimes against not just Japanese Americans, but all Asian Americans skyrocketed. So much so that this culminated in President Franklin Roosevelt issuing what is known as Executive Order 9066, or as it is better known, Japanese internment camps. Now, effectively, just a quick summary for what this did. It gave the United States military the authority to relocate any people living on the West Coast of the United States who had been deemed a national security threat, putting that in quotes, because in layman's terms, what that ended up being was almost exclusively Japanese people and Japanese American people. Now, in total, about 120,000 people were forcefully relocated into these camps, and 70,000 of them, about 70,000, were American citizens. And you can see on the map here, the camps spread all across the Western United States, and even a couple were as far east as Arkansas. Now, luckily for Yamasaki, neither he nor any member of his family ever spent a day in a Japanese internment camp. And this is because, as all of this was beginning to happen, he quite literally picked up his entire life and his family, and they moved to New York City, about as far away from all of this as you possibly could. Thankfully, this paid off for him. So despite this incredibly frightening situation, he was able to move to New York, and he completed his schooling there. He earned his degree from New York University. And then also around this time, he met and married his wife, who's a woman named Teruko. And they would go on to have 3 children in the coming years. But in 1945, which was almost immediately after the end of World War II, Yamasaki was hired as the head designer at a Metro Detroit-based architecture firm named Smith, Hinchman, and Grills. Now, naturally, since he now had a job in this area, he needed to find a house. However, this was a very daunting task for Yamasaki and his family, because at the time, many of the towns and cities in these areas had restrictive covenant laws that outright forbade Asian American people from purchasing property of any kind. Excuse me. And to put the cherry on top of all of that bad stuff, Yamasaki's own realtor, who was helping him try to find a house, told him to his face that he thinks it's almost impossible for Yamasaki to buy a home in this area. Now, luckily, Yamasaki was able to purchase a home for him and his family, a small farm home in Troy, just the next town over. Yet, he was working out of an office here in Birmingham during this time. So it sort of, you can see the irony in this situation. He was allowed to come here every day to work and contribute to Birmingham society and even design a building here, but he just was never allowed to live here simply because he was an Asian American person. And now you've heard me say a couple times, Yamasaki designed a building here in Birmingham. Well, that building is the Michigan Bell AT&T building. Now, if that name doesn't ring a bell, you might recognize it from the picture. This stands at the corner of Henrietta and Martin Street. It is directly across the street from the entrance to City Hall. And this building was first announced that it was going to be designed in 1948, with this image appearing in the Birmingham Eccentric in April of that year. And this was the first design sketch that was publicly released for the building. And the building itself was completed roughly a year later. And you can probably see almost immediately that there are some discrepancies between the sketch that was announced and what it looks like today. Most obviously, there are additional floors that have been built to the building. And now, the interesting thing about this was in the same article where they announced that the building was being designed, they mentioned how the foundation for the building was specifically being designed to accommodate for up to 2 extra floors to be added in the future, if they were needed. Turns out that they were needed. And also, you probably will notice that the sketch has the building envisioned in a much more open area than it is today, because if you go there now and you see it is quite literally wedged up right next to other buildings. You cannot walk in between any of these buildings. And the reason for this was, well, that was the original intent for the building. They wanted it to be this a little bit more open area, feel more welcoming to the community, where people can walk in and out a little bit underneath on the right side there. And technically, you still can do this because that opening on the right on the first floor is still there, but the effect has kind of worn off because there are also almost no windows on the ground floor of the building today. So it gives this very walled off, quite literally walled off feeling. And so you really can't see inside. It doesn't feel very welcoming anymore. However, it is still the same building that Yamasaki himself designed. And even more interestingly, we can start to see this is one of Yamasaki's more early projects, at least early relative to the things that he is more well known for building. But you can sort of see one of his distinct design styles sort of starts to come out, and you can see it a little bit in this building, and you'll know what I'm talking about a little bit more when you see some of his later works. And some of his later works, which, by the way, I put up on the screen now, I've picked out a few of my favorite works that he has designed that are here in southeastern Michigan specifically. Now, the one on the left is officially known as the Michigan Consolidated Gas Company building, but it's more colloquially known as 1 Woodward Avenue. And if you didn't really know what that building was before today, if you've ever been to downtown Detroit, you have almost certainly at least walked by or seen this building before. Additionally, Yamasaki also designed the McGregor Memorial Conference Center on the campus of Wayne State University, as well as another building on Wayne State known as the Helen DeRoy Auditorium. But I put up a picture of the conference center today because I like it a little better, so sorry about that. And also this picture brought to you tonight by our very own Donna Casaselli from the museum. So beautiful photography work by her. And now my personal favorite design from Yamasaki from this time period is right there on the bottom right. It's the main terminal of the Willow Run Airport. Now, this picture was taken in 1958, and unfortunately, this airport no longer utilizes passenger aircrafts anymore. So unfortunately, it does not look bustling like this anymore, but it is still there. And now, so during this time, while Yamasaki was designing these types of buildings, this was about halfway through the 1950s. And in 1954, Yamasaki almost lost his life. He almost lost a battle to stomach cancer, and it forced him to step away from his work for almost an entire year. And in 1955, thankfully, he recovered. He came back to work, but this time he formed his own firm. And this was called Yamasaki and Associates. And it was with this firm that he designed many of these buildings, among many other famous buildings. And with his firm, Yamasaki and Associates, they became so high profile that eventually Yamasaki appeared on the cover of Time magazine in January of 1963. And in this issue of Time magazine, they announced that Yamasaki was going to be commissioned to design the World Trade Center in New York City. So this was clearly his biggest project yet. And while the buildings themselves were completed in 1973, they should have served as, and I guess they still do technically, they should have served as Yamasaki's crowning achievement, the thing that he would be most proud of in his life. If anybody were to ask him, what is the project that you're most proud of? This should have been the thing that he would have been allowed to point to and go, that. Unfortunately, after the towers were built, there was a large wave of criticism that came back to Yamasaki and his firm. Now, however, it was interesting because the criticism was not necessarily completely about the design of the buildings, about people didn't like how it looked or things like that. It was more people criticizing the man who designed them, Yamasaki himself. And many of these letters that people wrote back were used incredibly racist language, incredibly discriminatory language. And there was so much of this stuff that Yamasaki was deeply shaken by this. And there's so much so that many experts in the architectural field actually believe that, the backlash to the World Trade Center might have cast a bit of a shadow over Yamasaki's later works because he was so deeply affected by this negative criticism. He didn't want to experience something like that again. And it just goes to show you that really, no matter how much somebody like Yamasaki was able to accomplish, no matter what kinds of massive projects he was able to do, there would always be a small but yet very loud group of people who would never really accept him as a fellow American, despite all of the great things that he was able to do. Now, however, if there is any consolation to this story, it's the fact that in 1974, just a year after the towers were built, Yamasaki moved to a home in Bloomfield Hills. Now, the best part about this home was it was designed by Yamasaki himself. So there's no longer a law that barred him from living here, and he got to design the home that he would live in. And you can see, I have up on the screen now a picture of the interior of the home and also a picture of Yamasaki and Teriko, his wife, sitting in the backyard of their home. So Minoru Yamasaki passed away in 1986, but his legacy still lives on in all of his buildings that still stand today around the world, even in the World Trade Center, Twin Towers, which no longer stand today, but they still are a reminder of Minoru Yamasaki in a way. And even his legacy still lives on here in Birmingham today with the Michigan Bell AT&T building. They really serve as a testament to all of the incredible things that he was able to do throughout his life, despite all of the obstacles that he was forced to try to overcome, which frankly only happened because he was an Asian American person. And this also goes to show you, if something like this happens to somebody like Yamasaki, who is so well known and so well accomplished, just imagine what may have been happening to people who are less well known than him, whose stories are not as well known. So we're going to be moving into our second story for tonight. But before I do that, I really quick want to give a little bit of a backstory on some of the laws that had been passed in the United States throughout our history that have historically restricted or made it more difficult for people from Asian countries to immigrate here in the first place. And I want to do this because these provide very, very important context for the next story that I'm about to tell all of you tonight. So the first one is the Chinese Exclusion Act of 1882, which I'm sure you may have already heard about. This is one of the more well-known laws like this. This was the first instance of the United States government outright banning immigration from a single country, just completely banning it. The wording they used in the law was, quote, Chinese laborers would not be allowed to enter the country. And it also included a clause that prohibited any United States court from granting people born in Asia US citizenship. So not the best law that's ever been passed in the United States. But that brings us over to 1917, which is something called the Barred Zone Act. Now, this basically expanded upon the Chinese Exclusion Act. And instead of saying people from China are not allowed to come here, pretty much what happened was it said, okay, look at this map. If you fall within this boxed in purple area right here, you are not allowed to come here. So don't even try. So also, once again, not a great thing. But then that leads us into 1921 with a law known as the Emergency Quota Act. And this is the most important one for tonight, because what this did was it was the first instance of the government imposing a numerical limit on immigration from certain countries. And essentially what it did was it took the recorded foreign-born population of the 1910 census and took 3% of the number, and that was the new quota. So if you had 100,000 people recorded as being foreign-born from Spain, living in the US, the quota would be 3,000 people from Spain are now allowed to come here each year. So pretty simple. But then in 1924, they reduced this limit to 2%. Now you can probably already imagine why this posed a problem, because since it was percentage-based, it heavily favored groups who already had an established community and a large presence in the United States, which was mostly people from European countries. And many of the countries from Asia and Africa and all around the world had very, very low quota numbers, many of them even reaching the lowest limit, which was 100 people per year. And this leads us into our second story tonight, which is about a couple named Weng and Moy Wong. Now, who are Weng and Moy Wong? Well, so both of them were born in the 1920s, and they were born in what is now the country of Malaysia. Now, at the time, it was not known as Malaysia. It was a part of the British Empire. It was known as British Malaya. But the important thing to know about Weng and Moy Wong was they were born in, let's call it Malaysia, but they had Chinese ancestry. Their family came from China. Now, these two individuals, they came to the United States in the late 1940s to study architecture. Talking about a lot of architects tonight, it's a complete coincidence, but Weng Wong got his master's degree in architecture from the Cranbrook Academy of Art in Bloomfield Hills in 1957. So that's how they ended up here in Birmingham. And so for the next couple of years, both of them worked as architects in Birmingham. Excuse me. But in 1959, so they had lived here for a couple of years, and by this time they had been in the country for over a decade. And so they decided to apply for citizenship, as you would. However, remember just a moment ago when I said that they had Chinese ancestry. Well, this made it a little bit complicated, to understate it a little bit. It made it a little bit complicated for them to obtain citizenship. Because what happened was when they applied for citizenship, the United States government registered them as being Chinese. So they put them in the quota for the country of China, which would have forced them to wait upwards of a decade to even have the chance to be considered for citizenship. Now, the Wongs argued against this, saying, we are not citizens of China. We were not born there. We should be registered as British subjects. We came from Malaysia. And so they spoke to people in the community here in Birmingham, their friends, coworkers, and drummed up enough support about this that eventually this issue reached the ear of Michigan Senator Philip Hart. Now, Philip Hart was Michigan Senator from, excuse me, my notes are here. Okay, sorry. So Philip Hart was Michigan Senator from 1959 until 1976, when he unfortunately passed away due to cancer. But before that happened, Senator Hart worked on behalf of the Wongs in the United States Senate to try to help them with their issue. And what he did was he compiled commendation letters from friends and coworkers of the Wongs, who were all advocating for them to be granted citizenship. And just to give you an idea of how highly regarded these people were in the community at the time, I'm going to read some excerpts from a couple of these letters really quick. So the first one comes from William Kemper of O'Keefe, Braun, Kendrick, and Finkbeiner lawyers at the time. So he wrote, quote, "I would vouch for Mr. Wong anywhere at any time and hereby do so in this letter. He is a man of integrity, industry, intelligence, and capability. His respect for and devotion to the United States of America and all that it stands for are of the highest degree. Mrs. Wong I have known since shortly after she married Weng. All of the character traits which I have mentioned above apply equally to her." And also Gerald Deal of Deal and Deal Architects at the time also stated, quote, "Dear Senator Hart, I am writing you on behalf of Weng C. Wong, whom I have known for 5 years. He is a highly talented architectural planner and designer and has done excellent work for our firm. I would vouch for his personal character, which is excellent to the best of my knowledge. Our profession and community benefit from his ability and talent." And these are just two among about 8 different letters from people advocating on behalf of the Wongs. So in February of 1962, Senator Hart compiled all of these, and he wrote a letter himself to the chairman of the Senate Judiciary Committee at the time, advocating for the Wongs to be granted their request, for the Wong's case to be looked into. And so the letter is quite short, so I'm just going to read through the whole thing really quickly right here. So, quote, "Dear Mr. Chairman, I introduced S 2855, that is the name of the bill, by the way, for the relief of Mr. and Mrs. Weng Wong, 2 fine and talented people. During their residence in Birmingham, Michigan, many have come to admire their abilities and personalities. Their very high cultural backgrounds would make them assets as citizens of the country. In seeking permanent residence, their unusual circumstances leave them outside available quota provisions. Born in Malaya, they are British subjects, but of Chinese ancestry. At the present time, both are employed as skilled craftsmen for an outstanding firm of architects. I enclose letters of commendation from fellow workers, employers, friends, who all state they cannot praise them too highly. In view of the foregoing, I believe that the passage of S 2855, granting permanent residence status to Mr. and Mrs. Wong, would be in the best interest of the United States. Sincerely, Philip A. Hart." So, as you can see, Senator Hart was quite moved by these anecdotes from the colleagues and friends of the Wongs. And thankfully, the bill S 2855 was submitted to the Judiciary Committee for review, and eventually it was passed in the Senate in June of 1962. And it did exactly what the Wongs wanted it to do. It transferred them from the quota for China into the quota for British Malaya, or the equivalent at the time. And now the Wongs eventually reapplied for citizenship in 1968, just a few years later. And when they did so, they received these petition index cards. And now you can see it correctly listed them as being from Malaysia. So after all of this, Weng and Moy Wong were allowed to become United States citizens. And once they did so, they continued to live and work here in Birmingham, thankfully knowing that they had a community around them that fully supported them in their endeavors. Because without the community of Birmingham and their friends, this would not have been possible. So moving into our third and final story for tonight, this concerns an entire family, not just an individual or a couple of individuals, and that is the Wong-Chung family. Now, quick disclaimer, you're probably seeing Wong, you might think, okay, is there a connection? No, there is no connection between Weng and Moy Wong and the Wong-Chung family, as far as we know. But this story does not start here in Birmingham. It actually starts in downtown Detroit. And it starts with a man named Harry Chung. Well, who is Harry Chung, you're probably asking? Well, Harry Chung is most well known for being the unofficial mayor of Detroit's Chinatown. Now, if that's the first time you're ever hearing about the fact that Detroit had a Chinatown, well, now you know. And when I say unofficial mayor of Chinatown, I say this because he didn't have an office. He was not an elected official. However, Harry Chung was usually regarded as the spokesperson for the Chinese American community of Chinatown during this time in Detroit's history. And this was around the 1930s/1940s. And in case you were wondering, the location for Detroit's Chinatown, or I guess better, the former location, is where I-75 roughly meets up with the MGM Grand Casino today. So you can probably already see where this story is sort of going. But during this time in the 30s and 40s, the Asian American community in Detroit thrived, and thanks in no small part to Harry Chung and his leadership as a spokesperson. Now, however, oh, sorry, I completely almost forgot. The Chung family also owned a restaurant in Chinatown, aptly named Chung's Cantonese Cuisine. And a little fun fact about the restaurant, it is actually credited with popularizing a dish known as almond boneless chicken, which if you've ever been to any Chinese restaurant or Chinese establishment, they almost certainly have almond boneless chicken on the menu. And you can thank this restaurant for popularizing it in this area of the United States. Now, unfortunately, Mr. Chung passed away in 1951. And when this happened, he was only 50 years old. So this came as a big shock to the community of Chinatown at the time, because this was completely unexpected. And people were so moved by this that they decided to host a large-scale celebration to honor the life of this man. And what they did was they hosted a 2-day funeral celebration and funeral parade. And there's a picture of it down there on the bottom right. And in total, this cost about $25,000. That's $25,000 of 1951 money. So that is a lot of money. And so it is incredibly heartwarming to see how the entire community rallied together to honor the life and mourn the loss of this man. But unfortunately, with Harry Chung's sudden departure, it initiated a slow and steady decline of Detroit's Chinatown, eventually leading it to the point where we are at today, where it no longer exists. And the next 3 decades, it was essentially, you would see event after event, bad thing after bad thing, just more chip away at the safety and stability of the city of Detroit as a whole, but also Chinatown. Excuse me. And this was not helped by the fact that the actual city of Detroit made numerous attempts to physically relocate all of the residents of Chinatown to a different sector of the city. And if you think that sounds like a logistical nightmare, yeah, it is, to put it very lightly. And so as this started to happen, people, instead of moving to a different part of the city and potentially thinking, well, if they're going to tell us to do this now, they might tell us to move again whenever. There's no point in staying here. So many people decided to move away from downtown Detroit. Some moved west, moved south, some even moved north to some of the suburbs of Metro Detroit. And this was only exacerbated by the riots in Detroit in 1967. And it shook the entire city to its core. And for Chinatown, like many other areas of Detroit, people no longer felt safe. They didn't think it was a good place to raise a family anymore, so more people left. Now, however, the final straw for Chinatown, at least according to many people who are very familiar with the history of the area, the final straw was the murder of a young man named Vincent Chin. Now, Vincent Chin, who was 28 at the time, this was in 1982, by the way, he was 27 at the time. On the night of his bachelor party, he was beaten into a coma over the head with a baseball bat by 2 former auto workers. And they did this because they believed Vincent Chin was Japanese. Now, Vincent Chin was a Chinese American man, but at this time, these auto workers blamed Japanese car companies and Japanese people for the decline of the auto industry here in Detroit. And they took this anger out on Vincent. And so they beat him into a coma, and less than 4 days later, Vincent died in the hospital. Now, both of the perpetrators of this crime were arrested. They went before a judge. However, neither of the 2 men ever served a single day behind bars. The only punishment punishment, in quotes, they received was 3 years of probation and paying roughly $3,000 in fines. So the judge in this case ruled that Vincent's life was only worth about $3,000. Now, unsurprisingly, this sparked massive protests in the Asian American community in Detroit. And they drummed up enough support for this that it eventually spread into other big cities around the country. And it sparked a bit of a national conversation over the civil rights of Asian American people. However, even though the communities rallied together for this cause, it wasn't enough to save Chinatown itself. And now, as more people started to move out and the area started to get more and more run down, now there is no longer a Chinatown in Detroit. The only thing that we have that we can know there was a Chinatown are pictures, and at the former sites, you may be able to find 1 or 2 plaques that tell a little bit about the history of the area. And now you're probably wondering at this point, how does this all connect to Birmingham? Well, I mentioned a few times how families and people would elect to move potentially to the suburbs of Metro Detroit, move a bit north. One of the families that did this was the family of Harry Chung. Specifically, it was his daughter, who was named Olive Chung. Now, Olive was born in 1929, and because of the status of her father within the community, she sort of by default became a prominent member of the Chinese American community in Detroit. And this is very evident because you can see multiple times, many times throughout her life, starting even as a child, Olive appeared in the Detroit Free Press for various things. You can see on the left over there, Olive is only 7 years old at the time. On the bottom, Olive is only 10 years old. So from a very young age, she was somewhat of a public figure. Now, her future husband was a man named Andrew Wong. Now, Andrew Wong was born in 1924, and he grew up in New York City. But once Japan bombed Pearl Harbor during World War II, he volunteered for military service, and he went and he served in World War II and came back successfully. And then during the Korean War, he still did military service, but he was never deployed abroad. He was stationed at the Selfridge Air Force Base in Macomb, Michigan, which is just at the end of M59. And so during this time, while he was stationed there, he was a very frequent visitor to the Detroit area, specifically to Chinatown. And this is how he met Olive. Now, the exact time when the two of them met is not known, but what happened? Excuse me, the screen turned off. Yeah. So sorry for all of you on Zoom. The screen has turned off here in the library.
To see it because it's on the computer.
Yeah.
Keep talking.
So,
they can hear you and see it.
Yeah, so
Please.
give us just a moment.
This is a connection here.
Yeah.
Oh, I wanted to go because this would be you connecting to that screen.
Well, I guess while we're waiting for this, if anybody has questions so far, I'd be glad to take them right now. Yes.
I thought Chinatown was down in the Chaos Corridor area near Wayne State.
So yes, do you remember how I mentioned that
Is that where it got moved?
Yes, that is exactly it. That is one of the locations where they tried to move Chinatown.
There was a Chinese.
Yes, exactly. So for anybody on Zoom that was not able to hear that, this woman in the audience tonight asked, I'm sorry, where did you say the location was again? I forgot.
It was in the Chaos Corridor.
Yeah, so she said that she thought that Chinatown was in the Cass Corridor in downtown Detroit. Now, I mentioned that it was where I-75 meets the MGM Grand Casino. And that's because the Cass Corridor is one of the areas where the city tried to move Chinatown once they were building the freeway, doing all this sort of expansion. So that's how that happened. And you can see how people would probably elect to want to leave after that happened, because think about the last time you moved, now try telling like 5,000 people they have to do that at the same time. For everybody on Zoom, but we should be all good to go now. Yes?
Did you
Good, so they heard everything. There was a question. Can
Okay.
I throw it to you?
Yeah.
Someone did ask, how in the heck did the murderers of Mr. Chin get off scot-free? I had a gut reaction, which was racism, but can you address that?
Yeah, so. Now, unfortunately, there's no like big grand conspiracy theory about that. It was pretty much, you can boil it down to racism and the fact that the judge in the case played the classic card of, oh, these are just young men. They don't really, they have their whole lives ahead of them, that type of thing. But you can find interviews with, maybe not necessarily interviews, but you can find anecdotes from Vincent's mother, who was living with him at the time, and her reaction to this. And it was not a pretty scene in that area at this time. So.
There was also sympathy for the young men because this is the time that the American car industry was starting to go into a tailspin.
Mhm.
And anyone, the Japanese car makers were being blamed for this.
Yep.
And so mistaking him as someone Japanese, they went after him because they felt their jobs were at risk and there was sympathy within the community for their plight.
Mhm. So we're all good?
We're good. I have one more question and then I'll stop interrupting you.
Okay.
Do you happen to know what street the home, what in Bloomfield Hills his home was?
I don't know off the top of my head right now. I would have to go back and look.
No worries, thanks. Yes, go ahead.
Okay, so. Yes, I was talking about Andrew Wong. Okay, so. I've already mentioned he was stationed at the Air Force Base, right? Yes, okay, so. In 1952, just 1 year after Harry Chung passed away, Andrew and Olive announced their engagement. And this announcement came in the Detroit Free Press, with Olive appearing in a picture once again. And then 1 year later, they were married. And that was also announced in the Detroit Free Press with another picture of Olive appearing. So you can see throughout almost her entire life, she was constantly in the newspapers, pretty much representing this community for various things. And now the two would go on to have 6 children together. In order, it would be Jeffrey, Pamela, Lisa, Jonathan, Andy, and Jody. And around this time in like the 1950s, the family still lived in Detroit. They still lived over in Detroit, and they also appeared in the Detroit Free Press again, but this time as a family. And by this time, it was mostly them ushering in the celebration for the Chinese New Year. You can see I've got a picture up there on the left of Pam and Jeff in 1960, celebrating the year of the rat. And then on the right, the family celebrating the year of the rabbit in 1963. But by the late 1960s, the exact year is not really known, but the family decided to move away from Detroit. They decided to move to the Birmingham area. Now, specifically, they moved to around the Birmingham/Beverly Hills border. And so during this time, all of the Wong children were still young enough that they attended school. They all attended public schools here in Birmingham. We have documents at the museum that show that all of the children attended Groves High School at one point in their life. And during this time, they partook in many of the extracurricular activities, things that you would expect children would do during their time in school, such as sports, musical concerts, all of that sort of thing. And although they had left Chinatown, we know that they carried their heritage with them. And we have documents at the museum that show evidence that the Wong children all still went to school for the purposes of studying to learn how to read, write, and speak in Chinese. And during this time, Andrew Wong himself was actually a board member and at one point the president of the Association of Chinese Americans, which had a base here in southeastern Michigan. And at one point, he was even the 2-time elected mayor of the city of Beverly Hills. So he was still very active in his own community and still doing things. And so not only did the family share their culture, keep their culture alive within their own family, they shared it with other people in the community. And they did this specifically through food. And there is one instance, we have this letter at the museum that shows that during one school day, Olive sent one of her sons, Jonathan, to school with a large tray of traditional Chinese almond cookies with the purpose of sharing them with the rest of the students in his class. And so on that day, Jonathan's teacher wrote a letter back to Olive raving about how much the cookies were, quote, thoroughly enjoyed by the class and how John was, quote, very proud to pass them around and made a point of telling us all that they were from your restaurant. Now, that restaurant in question was Chung's Cantonese Cuisine because the family still owned it at this time. Now, unfortunately, the recipe that Olive used, we did not have it in our possession at the museum. However, you can see up on the screen there, I have put up a recipe from a 1917 cookbook that is used to make almond cookies, or known as almond cake at the time, but it's almond cookies. And we assume that the recipe that Olive used was either this one or some sort of derivative on this type of recipe. And first thing somebody else said when I was showing them this presentation was, oh, wow, that's a lot of lard. And yes, it is. But in case anybody here is ever gets that baking itch and want to try to make some of these yourself, I have printed out a few of the cards for the recipe over there, and you can feel free to take one on your way out. And so as all of the Wong children grew up, they did essentially what you would expect people would do when they grow up. They went off to college, they got their own jobs, they started their own families, and found their own place in the adult world. Now, Andrew Wong passed away in 2016, and Olive followed suit only a few years ago in 2020. And that is where their story ends for us today. So that is all that I have for you tonight. So I want to thank you for coming here to join me. Sorry about the technical difficulties just a second ago. I hope you enjoyed tonight, and I highly encourage you to come back next month on the 9th of February for our next installment in this series, which is titled Oakland County's Early Abolitionists and the Local Underground Railroad Network. And that talk will be done by our museum director, Leslie. And for any additional information, you can check out our website, check out the Baldwin Library's calendar, or you can always, as always, you can find us on any of our social media sites. And so note this, this lecture will be recorded and put up on YouTube if you would like to watch it again for any reason or share it with anybody that you know. So does anybody have any further questions for me tonight? Yes.
Tell us your full name and what your role is. Do you work at the museum or do you work here at the library?
Okay, I'm just going to repeat the question so people on Zoom can hear it. Okay, so this woman here asked for me to give my full name and ask what my role is if I work at the museum. So my name is Justin Cook. You might not have known that's how you pronounce it when you saw my name because it's spelled K-O-C-H. But yes, I also work at the museum. We're coming up on a year of me working there in, I believe it would be March. So the reason that I'm actually doing the presentation tonight on Yamasaki and Asian Americans was that is the part of the exhibit at the museum that I designed, that I did research on. So there you go.
The Wong children still live in the area, do you think?
Information. So I'm gonna be honest, I'm not 100% sure where they live, but I do know for a fact that all of the Wong children are still alive. Yes. Because when I was researching into trying to find out when Andrew and Olive passed away or if they were still alive, I came across, I believe it was on findagrave.com. There was a listing for Andrew Wong, and there was a picture of a man who looked almost identical to the picture that I put up tonight, except one of the comments under the posting for Andrew Wong was from a woman named Pamela Wong, and it was from about a year ago. Okay. So that's when I thought, okay, so yeah, at least she is alive, and I couldn't find anything that signified that any of the other Wong children had passed on, because that would have been something that I would have came across during my research.
Yeah.
Yes.
Did you want the address of the Yamasaki house in Bloomfield?
Oh, yes, sure. I'll be more than happy to read it out.
Okay, 3717 Lake Crest Drive.
So in case anybody is wondering, I'm going to read out the address of the Yamasaki house that I showed just a minute ago. And correct me if I'm wrong, it is 3717 Lake Crest Drive.
Lake Crest.
Lake Crest Drive.
Yeah, it's all one word though, Lake
Yes.
Crest.
He did other domestic residents as well. There's some in Huntington Woods.
Mhm. Yes, Yamasaki did many more projects than the ones that I showed today. I just wanted to showcase some of the ones that people might find more familiar from being in this area. Like he has buildings in Saudi Arabia. There is a terminal at an airport in Saudi Arabia that he designed, and it's beautiful. He also designed many buildings like in Los Angeles. He designed towers in Los Angeles. He also designed I believe it is the Science Center in Seattle. I might have to go and check up on that, but him and his firm, they had projects everywhere, all around the world. Yes.
Did you have many Chinese ones? Having a Chinese connection?
What was that?
Many Chinese, Japanese buildings?
Oh, I don't believe he designed any buildings in the country of Japan,
No.
but something that's interesting is if you noticed with the McGregor Memorial Conference Center at Wayne State University, there's this large reflecting pool in front of the building. And this is interesting because you can see at one point in his life, Yamasaki did travel to Japan to look at the architecture over there and try to get inspired. And this is one of the things that he took away from his visit to Japan. And you even sort of see that when you see the interior of his home. It almost looks like how somewhat of a traditional Japanese home may look like. And something like the Bell Building, it doesn't have something like that. So you can really see this shift between when he before he went to Japan and then after he came back.
For those on Zoom, I did throw the registration for the February event and so you can log in. I know Justin already mentioned it. So you can go online. It's also in the thing I popped out. And I just wanted to mention, since Justin talked about Vincent Chen, there's that amazing, it's a YA book, but it's a great book. It was a Michigan Notable Book of 2022 about the Vincent Chen, From a Whisper to a Rallying Cry, the killing of Vincent Chen and the trial that galvanized the Asian American movement. So I will also put this on the table again. If everyone grabs them, I can put you on hold for them, but this is an excellent book if you wanted to check it out.
And for more information on that, I believe the website is vincentchin.org, because just either 1 or 2 years ago, they just celebrated it was last year, actually, 2022. They celebrated the 40th anniversary of this horrific murder. And there was a whole large event in downtown Detroit with speakers and conferences and all this type of stuff. So it's really interesting if you want to look more into it.
Great. Well, I will log everyone off Zoom. Thank you very much for coming out tonight. Enjoy your January.
Yeah, thank
See you in February.
So feel free to take a recipe if you want. So I think there's about 3 of them left, but if you haven't seen the exhibit yet and you want to see one of the pamphlets that we hand out at the museum, I've got 3 I think it's 3 of them left over